The gavel struck like thunder and the courtroom froze in its echo. Daniel Cross stared ahead as if the sound had split the world in two. The judge watched with stony patience while whispers rose and died. A trembling witness blurted, "I lied," and the air collapsed. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him as years of careful work bent out of shape. The prosecutor smirked, then masked it behind a practiced frown. Daniel said, "State your correction clearly," and his voice came out steady. The witness said, "I was told to change dates to bury a file." The gallery gasped, and someone dropped a pen that skittered like a scream. Daniel saw his sister's empty chair in memory, and swallowed grief like glass. He said, "Who told you?" And the witness shook, then pointed toward the defense table. The judge said, "Order," and the word fell like ice. Daniel locked his jaw and felt rage burn clean, sharp, and bright. The system had taught him to bow, but tonight it had bared its throat. He said, "We proceed," and the room held its breath as if justice might finally breathe. The confession did not free the room, it trapped it. Daniel felt the trap spring with velvet teeth. The judge said, "Counsel, proceed with caution," and each word fell like weights. Daniel said, "Name the person who ordered the change," and he steadied his breath. The witness said, "I can't say it in open court," and terror crawled across his face. The prosecutor said, "Objection," and the word rang thin. Daniel thought of nights spent mapping lies like constellations on his wall. He remembered a voicemail that had ended in static and fear. He said, "Then submit the name under seal," and his tone stayed calm. The judge watched him like a hawk measuring wind. Daniel's faith had once been doctrinal and bright. Now it was a scar that kept him upright when the storm pushed. He said, "Truth will survive the room that hates it," and the line surprised him. The court reporter paused, then resumed, keys cracking like distant hail. The gallery leaned in as if the air itself might whisper the name. Daniel thought of the person he had failed to save, and the thought sharpened him. He did not need mercy, he needed daylight. The judge said, "We will recess if this devolves," and the warning hovered. Daniel said, "It will not devolve," and the room believed him for a second. The witness said, "There are files in a storage unit," and the syllables felt contraband. The prosecutor said, "Speculation," and his cuff hit a twitch. Daniel's hands stayed still because stillness carried more force than fists. He said, "Address and unit number," and he waited without blinking. The witness said, "Building G Unit 23, and the court reporter looked up. Daniel tucked the number into a place where it could not be stolen. He said, "We move for immediate preservation," and the judge leaned forward. The storm hammered the windows like a jury that wanted in. Daniel did not look away because the truth hates averted eyes. The judge signed the preservation order with a deliberate stroke. The bailiff took it, and the room exhaled. Daniel said, "We will secure the unit tonight," and resolve anchored each word. The prosecutor said, "You are grandstanding," and the mask cracked at the edges. Daniel remembered a sunlit porch and a laugh silenced by a cell door. He said, "I am ensuring the record lives," and he meant it like a vow. The witness closed his eyes as if seeing a door he feared to open. The judge said, "Proceed," and the cadence was irrevocable. Daniel gathered his exhibits like a soldier counting rounds. He caught his reflection in the counsel table and did not flinch. He said, "We are not done," and it sounded like a prayer and a threat. Outside, sirens threaded with rain like stitches pulling a wound closed. Inside, Daniel's heartbeat found a metronome that felt like purpose. The hallway was colder than the courtroom and smelled of old stone and bleach. Daniel moved through it like a man late to his own verdict. A reporter stepped forward and asked, "Is the case collapsing?" and held out a mic. Daniel said, "Cases do not collapse, they reveal." And he did not slow. His phone buzzed with a message that had no name. He opened it and saw a storage lock code that agreed with the number. He said, "We go now," and his investigator nodded hard. Thorne shoved the doors as if urging him onto the street. A camera flash burned a white scar across his vision and faded. Daniel thought, if this breaks me, it will break me facing forward. He said, no more sealed rooms for the truth, and pushed into the rain. The city answered with sirens and wet neon smeared on asphalt. Somewhere behind him, the gavel's echo still walked the halls. The storage unit's steel door groaned open under the bailiff's bolt cutter. Daniel cross-stepped inside, the air stale with dust and secrets. His flashlight beam slid over cardboard boxes, stacked files, and a metal cabinet scarred with age. He said, seal this scene, his voice clipped and sure. His investigator, Mark Hale, mid-50s Caucasian male, nodded and began photographing every inch. Daniel pulled a file from a box and saw dates blacked out with heavy ink. He said, they erased the timeline, and his jaw locked. Outside, rain hissed on corrugated steel like a warning. The bailiff muttered, we'll need an evidence van, and Daniel didn't answer. He slid the file into an evidence bag, sealing it like a wound. The smell of old paper clung to his coat. He thought, this is where they buried the truth. The storm rattled the unit door, and he felt the system pushing back in steel and shadow. He said, we've got what we came for, but they'll know we have it. By morning, Daniel sat in his office surrounded by evidence bags. The blinds were half closed, slicing daylight into sharp bars. The phone rang, and he let it. His inbox filled with threats wrapped in polite legal language. One read, withdraw before this becomes unmanageable. He read it twice, tasting the rot in its civility. Rebecca Cole, his former ally, appeared at his door, her eyes calculating. She said, you're being reckless, and stepped inside without waiting. Daniel said, you were supposed to protect the record, his tone like tempered glass. Rebecca's gaze didn't falter. I'm protecting myself, she said, and so should you. Daniel leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. Outside, sirens wove through the city's hum. Inside, the air thickened with the smell of burnt coffee and betrayal. He said, then we're on opposite sides, and Rebecca left without looking back. Daniel entered the courthouse lobby, the marble floor echoing under his steps. The security guard gave him a look that lingered too long. At the metal detector, he was pulled aside. The guard said, random check, but his eyes told another story. Daniel emptied his pockets slowly, each movement deliberate. His briefcase was searched, fingers rifling through his notes with a precision that felt rehearsed. He said, satisfied, without raising his voice. The guard shrugged, handing it back without a word. Daniel knew the message. They were watching, waiting for a mistake. The elevator ride up was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. He stared at his reflection in the polished steel walls and saw a man they were trying to break. The doors opened to the familiar scent of varnish and stale air. He stepped out, spine straight, carrying the weight of the fight in his grip. In the courtroom, the prosecutor unveiled a motion to suppress the storage unit evidence. His voice dripped with mock civility. Daniel listened, every word aimed like a blade. He said, the evidence was lawfully obtained, standing with measured precision. The prosecutor said, chain of custody is compromised, his smirk almost invisible. The judge's gaze shifted between them like a pendulum measuring lies. Daniel produced the signed preservation order, placing it on the bench with quiet force. He said, the record is intact, and let the paper speak. The gallery murmured, tension rippling like heat. The judge said, motion under review, and struck the desk once. Daniel sat, fingers curled against his knee. He felt the system's machinery shifting gears, preparing the next strike. He thought, this is just the first blow. The air smelled of old wood and damp wool, and somewhere beyond the walls, rain started again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like crows to a carcass. Microphones and cameras pushed into Daniel's path. He kept walking, rain speckling his coat. A voice shouted, do you think you'll win? He said, winning isn't the point, and didn't slow. Another asked, then what is? Daniel said, the truth surviving, and stepped into the crosswalk. Cars idled, their tires hissing on wet asphalt. The city loomed in glass and steel, indifferent to the fight. Daniel's phone buzzed, a message with no sender. "We see you." He pocketed it without looking. The walk to his office felt longer, each block an arena. The storm thickened, streetlights flickering in the gray afternoon. By the time he reached his door, the cuffs of his trousers were soaked. He unlocked it, knowing the next move would come soon, and harder. The evidence sat spread across Daniel's desk like a crime scene of paper and ink. Each document was a fragment of a larger lie, every redacted line a scar. He traced one name again and again, as if repetition might unlock its secret. Mark Hale entered, rain on his coat, and said, "The witness has gone dark." Daniel didn't look up. "They got to him," he said, voice low. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. The phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the dim office air. Daniel let it ring until the machine picked up. "Now," a voice said, "stop digging, or we'll bury you with it." The line clicked dead. Daniel's pulse was steady, almost calm, the way a cliff feels before it crumbles. He said, "File everything," and began marking pages with a red pen. Outside, the city glowed in wet neon, indifferent to the war brewing inside four walls. The next morning, Daniel stood in a cramped records archive, its air heavy with the smell of mildew and forgotten truths. Metal shelves leaned under decades of boxed cases. The clerk, a wiry man in his 60s, said, "You didn't get this from me," handing over a dusty ledger. Daniel flipped it open, eyes narrowing at entries altered in different inks. "They rewrote the record," he muttered. The clerk's glance darted to the door. "You should leave before lunch," he said. Daniel slid the ledger into his case, feeling the weight of both the paper and the risk. Outside, sunlight tried and failed to cut through heavy clouds. Daniel knew daylight in this case was always just out of reach. Back in court, the prosecutor produced a witness Daniel had never heard of, a man whose testimony cut directly against his case. "You're fabricating," Daniel said, rising. The judge's gavel kept the room in check. The witness claimed to have seen events Daniel knew were impossible, his tone calm, almost rehearsed. Daniel cross-examined with surgical precision, but each question was met with smooth lies. In the gallery, Rebecca Cole sat stone-faced, her presence like a silent warning. Daniel caught her eye, searching for any sign of the ally she once was. There was none. He ended the cross with, "Nothing further," and sat, the taste of iron in his mouth. That night, Daniel drove through rain-slick streets toward the storage unit to double-check the chain of evidence. But when he arrived, the padlock hung open, its shackle bent. Inside, the shelves were bare. His breath clouded in the cold air as he stepped deeper, boots echoing in the emptiness. The files, the cabinet, even the dust, gone. He felt the hollow space in his chest mirror the room. A paper scrap fluttered on the floor. He picked it up, a typed note reading, "Too slow." Lightning flared, throwing his shadow high on the steel walls. He stood there, letting the rain hammer the roof like a verdict already written. The following day, Daniel faced the judge with an evidence log that now had gaping holes. The prosecutor feigned sympathy, saying, "It's unfortunate when defense evidence disappears." Daniel's voice was steady but laced with steel. This was no accident. The judge ordered an inquiry, but Daniel knew it would lead nowhere. Rebecca approached him in the corridor afterward, her heels sharp on marble. "You can't win this," she said softly. Daniel met her gaze. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I can make sure they remember how hard I fought." She shook her head and walked away, her silhouette fading into the courthouse crowd. The betrayal didn't come with fireworks. It arrived in a neat envelope slid across the table. Daniel cross-opened it to find a sworn statement from Rebecca Cole, his one-time ally, now aligned with the prosecution. Each line dismantled his argument, brick by brick. He read her words twice, noting the precision of her attack. Mark Hale said, "She's sunk us. his voice low, almost reverent in disbelief. Daniel's throat tightened, but his face stayed still. "No," he said, "she's just shown me where the cracks are." Outside the window, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and silent. Inside, the air smelled of ink and betrayal. He set the statement down, as if it were a live wire, and pushed back his chair. He said, "We adjust," and the decision tasted bitter, but necessary. Courtroom tension was thicker than the oak panels lining the walls. Rebecca sat at the prosecution's table, posture impeccable, eyes forward. The prosecutor called her to the stand, and Daniel felt the air shift. She raised her right hand, swore in, and began her testimony with clinical detachment. Her voice carried the precision of someone cutting cleanly with a sharp blade. Daniel cross-examined, every question layered with memory and strategy, but she parried with answers that closed doors instead of opening them. The judge watched closely, his gavel hand twitching once. Daniel's final question hung in the air. "Do you stand by every word?" Rebecca's gaze met his, steady, unblinking. "Yes," she said. After court, Daniel stood in the marble corridor, the buzz of voices and footsteps muted around him. Rebecca passed by, her perfume faint and familiar. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said without turning his head. She stopped, her heels clicking once as she pivoted. "You made your choice. I made mine." Her tone was steady, but her eyes flickered for half a second. Then she was gone, swallowed by the stream of lawyers and clerks. Mark appeared at Daniel's side. "She's not coming back," he said. Daniel didn't answer. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, glass catching the gray afternoon light, like an unfinished verdict. That night, Daniel's office was lit only by the desk lamp, casting long shadows over the stacks of evidence. He replayed Rebecca's testimony in his mind, every inflection, every pause. His red pen bled circles and notes across legal pads, mapping the places she had left gaps. The phone rang once, no caller ID'd, and then silence. Rain returned, tapping on the window like fingers impatient for an answer. Daniel closed the folder and said to himself, "We fight the case we have, not the one we wish we had." The words felt like armor being strapped on. The next morning, Daniel entered the courtroom, knowing the jury had seen the damage Rebecca's words had done. He adjusted his tie, the knot feeling heavier than usual. The prosecutor smirked as Daniel approached the lectern for his next motion. His voice carried steady, but the undercurrent was steel. "We move to strike portions of yesterday's testimony on grounds of conflict of interest," he said. The judge's brow lifted slightly, the gallery murmuring at the boldness. The prosecutor objected, but Daniel pressed forward, each sentence precise and deliberate. The motion was denied, but the seed of doubt was planted. He turned back to his table, catching the faintest shift in the jury's posture. Daniel Cross was halfway through reviewing depositions when Mark Hale burst into the office, rain dripping from his coat. "You're not going to believe this," Mark said, placing a flash drive on the desk. Daniel plugged it in and watched a grainy security video play. Michael Grant, the missing witness, walking into a diner less than an hour ago. "He's alive," Daniel said, the words tasting like shock and adrenaline. Mark nodded. "And he's willing to talk." Daniel's mind raced, calculating how this could shift the trial. He grabbed his coat and said, "We find him before they do." The streets outside were slick with rain, neon reflections trembling in puddles. Somewhere in that city was the one man who could burn the prosecution's case to the ground. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried eggs, its linoleum floors worn thin. Daniel slid into the booth across from Michael Grant, early 40s Caucasian male with unshaven stubble and eyes darting like trapped prey. "You have no idea what they'll do if I talk," Michael said. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I know exactly what they'll do. I've been fighting them for months." Michael's hands trembled as he sipped his coffee. "They paid me to disappear," he confessed. Mark sat beside Daniel, silent but watchful. The rain beat against the diner's glass front, muting the city beyond. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, his tone more plea than command. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with the energy of a new development. Daniel called Michael Grant to the stand, and the prosecutor's smile faltered for the first time. Michael swore in, his voice shaking. He testified about the bribe, the threats, the instructions to vanish. They wanted the truth dead, he said, his gaze fixed on the jury. Daniel's questions were sharp, deliberate, leaving no room for evasion. The prosecutor objected twice, but the judge overruled both. In the gallery, Rebecca watched with unreadable eyes. When Michael finished, the room seemed to inhale all at once. Daniel sat down, knowing this testimony was a spark in a room full of dry timber. After recess, Daniel found Michael in the witness room, his hands clenched. "They're going to come after me now," Michael said. Daniel replied, "They already have. The difference is, now you're in the open." Michael gave a humorless laugh. "That's not safer." Mark entered, shutting the door behind him. "There's a car parked outside that's been there since we got here," he said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We'll get you protection," he promised. Michael looked at him like a man trying to decide if he could believe in anything again. Rain tapped against the small frosted window, the sound like a countdown neither of them could stop. That evening, Daniel returned to his office, drenched from the storm. On his desk was an unmarked envelope. Inside, a single photograph of Michael leaving the courthouse, a red X drawn across his face. Daniel stood there, the rain dripping from his coat to the floor. Mark appeared in the doorway. "They're moving fast," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "So will we." He placed the photo face down and began drafting an emergency motion for protective custody. The desk lamp's light caught the water on his sleeve, making it glint like steel. The war wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The courtroom was silent as Daniel Cross rose for his closing argument. The jurors watched him with a mixture of fatigue and curiosity, the long trial pressing on their shoulders. Daniel's voice was steady, deliberate. "This case is not about me. It's about a truth that has been chained and beaten, but not broken." He paced slowly, his footsteps soft against the carpet. "You've heard lies, you've seen fear, and you've seen courage from those who had every reason to stay silent." He gestured toward Michael Grant, seated in the gallery under protective watch. "You are the last barrier between justice and a system that thinks it can outlast you." The judge's gavel hand hovered as the room hung on his words. Daniel ended with, "Justice doesn't arrive by accident, it arrives because you demand it." The prosecutor followed, his tone smooth but edged with contempt. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is theater," he said, gesturing at Daniel without looking at him. "The defense wants you to believe in conspiracies because they have no facts." Daniel watched, jaw tight, as the prosecutor spun a careful web, dismissing Michael's testimony as desperation. Rebecca Cole sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the jurors, her posture rigid. The prosecutor ended with, "The law demands verdicts based on evidence, not on emotional performances." The gallery murmured, and the judge called for order. Daniel leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, breathing through the frustration. Outside during the lunch recess, Daniel stepped into the cold drizzle, the courthouse looming behind him. Mark Hale joined him under a shared umbrella. "They're leaning on the jury," Mark said quietly. Daniel's brow furrowed. "We can't stop them from trying," he replied, "but we can make sure they fail." Across the street, a black sedan idled, its windows tinted dark. Daniel's eyes lingered on it for a moment before he turned back toward the courthouse steps. "Let them watch," he said. The rain beaded on his coat, the drops sliding down like seconds ticking away to the verdict. Back inside, the judge instructed the jury, his voice even but final. "You are the finders of fact. You must deliberate without prejudice." The jurors filed out, their expressions unreadable. Daniel gathered his notes slowly, every sound in the courtroom amplified in the hush. Michael leaned forward from the gallery and whispered, "What if they don't believe me?" Daniel turned, his expression steady. "Then we appeal, and we fight again." He placed a hand briefly on the rail between them before walking out to the hallway, where the air felt both too still and too loud. Hours later the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. Daniel stood in the empty hallway outside the courtroom, staring at the double doors. Mark arrived, his face pale. "They're coming in," he said. Daniel straightened his tie and exhaled. The doors opened, the jurors filing back to their seats. Every step they took echoed like a drum beat. The foreperson held a folded slip of paper in both hands. Daniel's pulse slowed, each beat deliberate. Whatever was written there would decide not just the case, but the years he'd spent fighting. He sat, hands flat on the table, ready to hear the words that would either set the truth free or lock it away forever. The judge unfolded the paper with a deliberate slowness, his glasses low on his nose. The room was so still Daniel could hear the rustle of the jury foreperson's coat as she sat down. "On the charge of obstruction of justice," the judge read, "we find the defendant not guilty." A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly silenced by the gavel. Daniel closed his eyes for one measured breath, letting the verdict settle. The judge continued through lesser charges, the words, "guilty" and "not guilty," falling like alternating blows and reprieves. When it was over, the courtroom exhaled. The prosecutor scribbled something on a pad without looking up. Daniel glanced toward Michael Grant, whose shoulders slumped in exhausted relief. As the court adjourned, Daniel gathered his files with slow precision. Michael approached, his voice low. "We won, right?" Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "We stopped them today," he said, "but they'll be back." Michael nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. Across the aisle, Rebecca Cole slipped out without a word, her face unreadable. Daniel watched her go, wondering which part of her testimony had been truth and which had been survival. The clerk called for order as reporters pressed against the rail. Daniel stepped aside, letting the moment belong to the verdict rather than to him. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed in rapid bursts, lighting the drizzle like a strobe. A reporter shouted, "Is this justice?" Daniel paused at the top of the steps, rain beading on his coat. "Justice is never finished," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. Mark Hale stood beside him, shielding him from the worst of the questions. The black sedan from before idled across the street, engine humming. Daniel met its dark windows for a moment before descending the steps, each footfall deliberate. The wet stone reflected the city lights, a distorted mirror of the fight just won and the battles ahead. Later in his office, Daniel stood by the window, the city a blur of rain and light. The desk behind him was covered in closed files, each one a scar from the case. Mark set 2 glasses on the table and poured whiskey, the amber catching the lamplight. "You could walk away now," Mark said. Daniel took the glass but didn't drink. "And leave the next one undefended?" he asked. Mark didn't answer, and the silence between them said enough. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the night. Daniel finally sipped, the burn anchoring him to the moment. As the clock neared midnight, Daniel placed the empty glass on the desk and looked once more out the window. Somewhere in the city, the same system he had fought was already adjusting its game. He thought of Rebecca's steady gaze on the stand, of Michael's shaking hands, of the jurors' unreadable faces. He whispered to himself, "Justice isn't blind. She just chooses who to see." The words hung in the quiet like smoke. He turned off the lamp, letting the room sink into shadow, and walked out without looking back. The rain kept falling, washing the streets clean for a night, but not for long.